Welcome back to the show, everyone. As you can see, I am joined by Seyed Mohammad Marandi, joining once again to break down the latest developments. So first, we have Israel attacking Iran. Well, that is what Israel is telling CENTCOM. They informed the Israeli military, did Commander Admiral Bradley Cooper of CENTCOM, that Israel does not need approval nor support from the U.S. to wage war against Iran, adding, "We are currently making preparations to start the war. Israel is preparing for a unilateral strike on Iran as it concludes that the U.S. is no longer willing to finish the war on its own terms." This is according to Channel 13 in Israel. Well, on that last point, they may have somewhat of a point. Donald Trump has quietly admitted defeat, according to the Wall Street Journal, signaling he's willing to end the war on Iran without a nuclear deal if the Strait of Hormuz simply opens, a humiliating retreat from his demand for unconditional surrender. At least this is per U.S. officials into the Wall Street Journal. Now, this is being complicated by Iran's conditions, which I know, Professor Marandi, you have talked about, which have been released by Iran's Supreme National Security Council, outlining new conditions for the reopening of the strait. It not only includes a permanent end to the war, the lifting of the U.S. naval blockade, and the withdrawal of U.S. forces from the region, lifting of sanctions, the frozen assets given back, war operations, but also an end to the U.S.'s threats of military action and all conflicts, including Palestine, Lebanon, and Yemen. So, Professor Marandi, given these developments, what do you make of this report of Israel attacking alone? We've heard this before. How serious are Iranians and Iran taking this?
First, I should point out that these are not new conditions by Iran. These are within the framework of the MOU. But in the MOU, Iran doesn't, Palestine, Yemen, and Iraq aren't named, but it says all fronts. So now Iran is becoming more specific, and Iran has at the negotiating table brought up Gaza and Palestine. And the Iranians and Dr. Ghalibaf, who is the chief negotiator, did tell different Palestinian delegations that Gaza and Palestine are a part of the Iranian demands. But with regards to the United States refraining from threatening Iran, that's actually explicit. It has explicitly said in the MOU that what the statement yesterday that came out of the Supreme National Security Council basically means is that the MOU has to be fulfilled in full. In other words, the Iranians are not going to allow the Americans to interpret it in their own way, in a way in which Trump would like. So they spelled out they said what the region means. The region means Palestine, and it didn't even say Gaza. It says Palestine. It says Yemen. So if the United States wants normalization, that's the only way forward. They have to stop exterminating Palestinian children, and they have to stop the siege and slaughter of the people of Yemen, which has been going on for well over a decade now. And the Saudi regime, they've carried out a genocide in Yemen, not dissimilar to what the Israeli regime did in Gaza, with the support of Trump and the United States, both before and after Trump, his first term in office. So that's no longer acceptable. They can no longer starve women and children in Yemen, regardless of what the Saudis may want for Iran or the Israelis and the United States, who are all clear allies. The Iranians are saying that the starvation siege in Yemen has to come to an end, and of course the same in Iraq. The U.S. and the Saudis have no right to bomb the Iraqi people whenever they like. So they've made that very clear that this will no longer be tolerated if there's good, and this has to be sorted out in any potential deal. With regards to the Israeli regime, the Israelis have no ability to wage war against Iran and come out with any success. They'll fail they'll swiftly fail. The Iranians are prepared to destroy the regime with their missile capabilities. They'll overwhelm them, and their missile capabilities are enormous. And the Iranians have destroyed the radar defenses that the Americans have created across the region to help Israel in the Persian Gulf, in Western Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in northern Iraq, which will make it a lot easier for Iranian drones to strike their targets. But the Israeli regime will need the United States for any war because the Americans would have to refuel their jets, just like they did during this war and just like they did during the 12-day war. So if the regime attacks Iran, the United States will have to be involved. And if it is involved, then that means they're waging war against Iran, and they will receive a military response. But if the Americans don't get involved, then Iranian firepower will overwhelm the regime very swiftly. Even with U.S. support, the same will happen, but it'll be much worse without the Americans. So I don't think that's the real issue. The real issue is the fact that the United States continues to pose a threat to Iran, and it has not removed any of its forces. And these American soldiers are in the region, despite the extraordinary heat of the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Oman. They've been stuck here for 6 months at least now. There is a belief that the United States could carry out attack in the days ahead, and so if anyone thinks that the war is over, they're naive. There's a possibility, despite the shortages that exist, despite the fact that the munitions of the U.S. military are very low in some key areas. But we have to remember that the Israeli regime and the Zionist lobby, they still are extremely powerful in the United States. And they can push Trump towards war. I mean, it's not difficult to imagine them pushing Trump towards war again. They are the ones who push him in the first place. We all recall how Joe Kent, in his resignation letter, said that Iran was not a threat to the United States. Iran was not developing a nuclear weapon. This is about the Israeli lobby and the Zionist lobby and the Israeli regime. Well, the Zionist lobby and the Israeli regime haven't gone anywhere. So the threat of war continues to exist, and the Iranians are preparing themselves. In fact, I think that there's going to be a change in the Supreme National Security Council shortly, and Iran is prepared for war. Doesn't mean it will happen, but Iran is prepared for.
Well, I was going to ask you, Professor Marandi, as you were talking about the U.S. striking in the coming days, I was going to ask you whether you believe that these reports about Israel pushing the United States once again, or claiming that they are going to unilaterally strike. I find that a very interesting word to use, given that it literally outs the fact that Israel and the U.S. are coordinating on the war against Iran. But at the same time, I'm wondering how much you think that this is either plausible deniability, meaning that the United States will strike in the coming days using Israel as a cover, or is it the fact that, Israel actually is seeing that the United States wants to get out of this and the terms are highly insufficient? Iran just said they're not even talking to the U.S. right now. So the terms are obviously highly insufficient to Iran. So it's quite the quandary for the U.S., but I wonder how much you see as this as Israel pushing the U.S. back into strikes, or the U.S. just using this as plausible deniability to then rip whatever it has left in Asia and elsewhere to keep going with the war.
It's difficult to say. I don't have an answer to that question. We all recall when Rubio at the beginning of the war basically said we fought for the Israeli regime. The regime wanted to launch a war, so we got involved in the war. So that could easily happen again. The United States is very obedient to the Israeli regime and the Zionist lobby, and Trump has been the most obedient of all U.S. presidents. So it's hard to say. What I do think, though, is important to remember is the Iranian threat. That if the United States launches attacks on Iran's infrastructure, Iran will wipe out the infrastructure of the countries that are complicit in this war. And of course, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the Emirates, or Kuwait, I think I said them all, I'm not sure. And perhaps even Oman, they're all, and of course the Israeli regime, they're all complicit in this war. So they're all a part of this war. They're all partners in crime. Sometimes I see these, these bot or these, these trolls and bots online saying that Iran is striking like, the Arab countries. This is where the United States is waging its war from, and they are funding. I may have told you this before. The Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf, they are funding the war. They pay the United States for those bases. You would think it's the other way around, that like the United States goes and takes this piece of land and then they pay a rent and they use that base. No, these countries, they pay for all the costs. So they're paying for a big chunk of the war expenditure, whether it's the Emirates or the Qataris or the Saudis or the Bahrainis or the Kuwaitis. In the case of Jordan, it's probably just handed over free to the United States because Jordan is extremely obedient to the Americans. So they are all part of this war, and they will suffer the consequences. But it's not only going to be their problem. If their infrastructure is destroyed, that means their countries will collapse, and that includes Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia won't survive. I don't think it'll survive. And when that happens, I think it's pretty clear that the global markets will crash, because when people wake up and see these sites burning in the news, that will bring a panic to the markets. There's no way that anyone is going to be able to talk up the markets or manipulate the markets then. So even if the Strait of Hormuz is open, then that doesn't make a difference anymore, because there will be nothing left to export or import. So we have to, always keep this in mind, that the Iranians this is their deterrence. The Iranians did not start the war; they did not escalate, but they're the victims. But this is deterrence. If Trump actually does go and try to exterminate the Iranian people and to wipe out the civilization and to destroy the infrastructure so that the state would collapse, then have no doubt that Iran will destroy those regimes that assisted the United States. The only difference is that Iran will not collapse, but those regimes definitely will. And that will bring down the global economy, and then many, many governments will come down, including many U.S. allies beyond these countries. So it's not, this is a very, very serious situation. But again, we don't know if the United States is going to do this or not. But it seems, they have not removed anything from the region. All of their assets are in place. And of course, Iran is building up its defenses. It's building new missiles, new drones. It's expanding its underground cities, missile cities, drone cities. It's preparing for a potential land offensive. They are preparing, but that doesn't mean the United States won't carry out another war of aggression.
That fact that you stated earlier, that the Gulf states are paying for the U.S. to essentially militarily occupy their countries and use them as basing stations for war, is an astounding one, and people should understand this from the standpoint of sovereignty. That these states don't have sovereignty, and this was back in 2020 during the first Donald Trump administration. Right toward the end, CNN reported that Saudi Arabia had paid $500 million in one sitting toward the cost of shouldering and having U.S. troops in their country back when there was an increase in U.S. troops stationed there at about 2,000 more. So I mean, just that alone. And Donald Trump at that time also was boasting that Saudi Arabia literally put $1 billion inside into the U.S. Treasury directly in order to make good on this huge agreements that he had with the Gulf states, which were simply mafia-like agreements between these states. But Professor Marandi, despite this, Israel, what gives Israel the confidence to make these statements to the media about attacking Iran unilaterally, given that Iran has already went through what seems to be a very strategic campaign to decimate the layer of defenses that were protecting Israel at one time, particularly the most important one, which was Jordan, and the air defenses that were there. Those are essentially gone and are not likely to come back in any significant way anytime soon. So what gives Israel the confidence to make these threats, do you think?
I don't know how confident they really are. I'm pretty sure that Netanyahu knows what this will lead to, but he's a desperate person. He wants to remain in power. I think the elections in the Israeli regime are maybe a week before the elections in the United States. So we have about 2.5 months left till their elections, and he wants to look. He'll do anything to remain in power. These could be threats just to increase confidence among the population, which clearly believes that they lost the war. We know from polls that I think roughly 90% of the Israeli population believes that they lost the war against Iran. So perhaps he wants to strengthen morale, boost morale. Perhaps this is an attempt to intimidate so that the regime in the United States could gain concessions. I don't know. I have no idea. But perhaps it's also being said to push the United States towards attacking Iran. Going back to what the U.S. Secretary of State said at the beginning of the war, that the Israelis were going to attack, so we decided to attack too. I think that's more or less what he said.
Yeah, and well, here's the poll that you're referring to. 90%, 2% of Israelis believe Iran emerged as the winner after this war, and this was back during the original signing of the memorandum of understanding back in June. So, yeah, not a lot of morale on the Israeli side, at least on the settler side of things around this war. Well, speaking of Saudi Arabia, Professor Marandi, what do you make of the latest round of strikes and in this counter siege by Yemen? There are incredible reports right now of Yemen not only hitting Aramco again in Jazan, their oil refinery, but also now hitting gas, the Saudi Aramco Berry gas plant in Al Jubail, Saudi Arabia. So major escalations there, and no sign that Saudi Arabia is tapping out just yet. So what do you make of this, especially in light of this so-called Mecca, NATO, whatever the hell it's supposed to be, agreement between the three states? You call them backstabbing states, Saudi Arabia. Well, Pakistan, a little more complex, but Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan. What do you make of all this?
We know that the Saudis consider Yemen to be their backyard, which is, of course, not something that Yemen accepts. Yemen is an ancient civilization. It is a civilizational state. It's been around far, far before Saudi Arabia ever existed, many times over, many times over. So the Saudis have tried to starve Yemen since 2015 and slaughter them into obedience. they did what they did to Yemen in 2015 with the green light of Obama, not Trump. What they did to Yemen was not dissimilar to what the Israeli regime did to Gaza. And this was one of the great crimes of our time. And the only difference was that the genocidal attacks were carried out in silence. There wasn't much news. They were bombing schools, they were bombing school buses, they were bombing funerals. I think in one funeral they killed like hundreds of people. They starved the population. American ships and other ships in the Red Sea, they would block boats from taking food or medicine into Yemen. I recall one former U.S. Official, someone affiliated to I think he was military, saying that he was on a ship in the Red Sea and they blocked it. They stopped the boat and it was full of medicine, and the American Navy dumped it into the sea, the medicine, which was destined for Yemen. So that's what they were trying to do. It was, another Gaza. But the only difference was that Yemen being larger and much more capable, it had the armed forces of Yemen and Ansar Allah were able to fight back and resist. And the Saudis had the same support that they have now. The collective West was supporting them. We all recall what they were doing, and then the region was supporting them. All of these countries, all of the countries in the region, of course, except for Iran, they were supporting Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in carrying out this genocidal war. Of course, a couple of years later, after Saudi Arabia and the Emirates imposed a siege on Qatar, the Doha distanced itself, and so did Erdogan, because he and the Qatari regime are bound to one another. So then later they distanced themselves. In fact, I remember I was on Al Jazeera a couple of times at the beginning of the genocidal war in Yemen on a show called Inside Story twice. And then after that, I was no longer invited on Al Jazeera for a very, very long time. Sort of like in Syria. In Syria, it was the same. They stopped inviting me. They banned me for a while. And then after Yemen, it was the same. So everyone was on board with this, with this murderous assault. Well, back then, Yemen was weaker than now. And Saudi Arabia was stronger. And Saudi Arabia was more wealthy. And Saudi Arabia wasn't facing the circumstances that it is facing today. So if any country assists Saudi Arabia in this war, it's not going to make it any better than it was back then. And back then, ultimately, the Saudi regime failed. When Yemen began to develop its own missile industry and its drone industry, they have smart young engineers, very smart and dedicated people. Of course, Iran helped, but the Yemeni, they made it an indigenous industry, and they built their own underground bases, as we saw when the Americans launched their war against Yemen, because Yemen was supporting the people of Gaza, and the Americans failed. So these young men and perhaps women, I don't know, they began firing at Saudi oil assets, and Saudi Arabia was forced to end the war and accept a ceasefire. But ever since then, they've continued to impose a siege on Yemen. And when an Iranian commercial airline was taking a delegation back from Iran, that was the delegation that was taking part in the funeral of Ayatollah Khamenei, the martyr, they bombed the airport as the Iranian plane was moving to land, a commercial plane where, with an ordinary crew of men and women. That outraged Iran, and of course it was an act of war against Yemen. So everyone should be siding with Yemen instead of collaborating with Saudi Arabia. I mean, no country created a coalition with Saudi Arabia over Gaza, over Lebanon, over Syria. I mean, look at Syria right now. They've occupied huge parts of the southern part of the country. Where's the coalition to push back the Israelis there? Or in Lebanon, where the Israeli regime is occupying the south of the country. And as we speak, they're destroying all the forests. They're burning down all the forests in southern Lebanon. They're destroying the villages that go back hundreds of years, and now they're destroying the whole environment, everything. They're turning the southern part of Lebanon into a wasteland. Where's the Saudi coalition over for them? Where's the Saudi coalition for the West Bank? So it's only for the enemies of the United States that these coalitions are built. Must be some coincidence.
Yeah, well, some have remarked, Professor Marandi, that what could be happening right now is some kind of strategy of tension, because you have the United States on the one hand constantly leaking to the media through these anonymous officials that they want to get out of the war, but they only really care about the Strait of Hormuz, and they want to do some kind of basic trade with Iran. And Iran has made it very clear, as has been the case since June and since before June, that the MOU terms and now expanded terms are the ones that Iran will take. And then you have Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, and Israel, all engaging in their own kind of either aggression or both a combination of aggression and, just out and out warmongering, as we see against Yemen. So, do you? Many people believe that the United States and Donald Trump is trying to taco out of this, but the landscape doesn't really support that. So, how do you see
Taco out of what?
taco out of the war? Taco out of war, and
taco.
yeah, the taco, yeah, to
I thought
chicken
you said
out.
talk them out of. Okay,
Oh no! That's my Boston accent there. Taco out of war. But the landscape again seems to not support this, despite all of the reports. So, how do you see this overall landscape? Because now it does include now Turkey and Pakistan. They're in this so-called Mecca Defense Pact, but the landscape doesn't support what Iran had said about it, which was, they support independent security alliances and whatnot, and only that can only be positive. But the landscape looks like actually the U.S. is constantly trying to push its vassals and its proxies to, take on more war. What do you make of this?
I don't think. I mean, if you mean this Saudi-led coalition with this pact, I don't think it's all that serious. Yemen today bombed in retaliation Saudi Arabia, and there hasn't been any response from Turkey. The Turkish Air Force has not bombed Yemen yet or anything like that. So for the moment, I don't think that's really serious. It's not going to look good. I mean, there's a lot of criticism of what Turkey did in Turkey because of the nature of the Saudi regime and because of the broader regional political and military situation. So I don't see that really as a big issue. Although I do think that the chances for war a new active war assault by the United States is quite possible. I'm not saying it's probable because I don't know, but I do know that people here are taking the situation very seriously, and of course the United States, as usual, they have their assets based in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Oman, in Jordan. They have a lot of the radar installations, as I said, were destroyed, although the ones in Turkey continue to function. And then there's the Israeli regime, where and also the assets are stored in countries outside of the region as well, for a possible attack. So it's impossible to really say what will happen because Trump is Trump. And even though it may sound reasonable for him to end the war and to just implement the MOU as he promised to do, but that's not how Trump functions, and that's not what the Israeli regime and the Zionist lobby want. So, and as we've discussed this before on multiple occasions, and every day that goes by, the global economic situation deteriorates. it's been moving more slowly than I thought 4 or 5 months ago, but it's still moving in that direction, especially now that the Red Sea is closed to Saudi oil. I mean, the Strait of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is closed, and the Saudis are being attacked in retaliation to their attacks. That has cut their oil exports even further, and the Emirates is not exporting oil either right now. So the situation is worsening rapidly, but more slowly than at least I anticipated 2-3 months ago.
Yeah, and then with the economic situation, it is like kind of it's a desperate one in that it seems like the United States is taking every measure, not just emptying its reserves, but also working with various countries, especially in Asia, to try to also weather this. So that explains some of the slowing there, and with the weapons crisis and the defense systems crisis that have been talked about for days and days now, the United States does just continue to pull from places. I think a lot of the big crisis about the shortages for the U.S. empire is that the longer it goes against Iran, these dreams of some kind of confrontation with China and Russia, which were always, I think, incredibly fantastical and catastrophic to even consider. But nevertheless, there are many neocons who want this. So the United States has been actually pulling air defense, systems and all of that, and shipping them to their base in West Asia, and that what explains why the U.S. can continue to start these smaller acts of war than rather than not be able to at all. So, I wonder what you have to say about this, Professor Marandi, this notion that, the longer the U.S. tries to defeat Iran, the more incapable it is of expressing and meeting its own interests as an empire outside of Iran, meaning these other countries that the United States has ire toward and, of course, has a deep desire to weaken and destroy.
Well, it was Robert Kagan, right, in the Atlantic, who wrote that article saying that this was the biggest defeat of the United States ever, bigger than Vietnam for a host of reasons. Well, that was before the last chapter of the war. That was before the United States resumed the war after it violated the MOU. And this last chapter didn't go well for the United States. In fact, it was worse than the 40 days of fighting because Iranian missiles and drones were hitting hard everywhere. And the United States was not achieving any success in the Strait of Hormuz. It was attempting to open the strait. So the situation today for the Trump regime is worse than when that article was written. And this is draining U.S. wealth. It's draining U.S. military capabilities. All these military assets that have been gathered in the region, they're not being protected in ideal conditions. There a lot of this high tech equipment is in a very humid and very hot environment, and these bases were not built to store all this, especially since the bases which did exist, they're all destroyed now. So in the height of summer, the United States is storing its equipment in conditions that are not ideal, and the Americans have to constantly bring new equipment, and planes constantly go back and forth. And of course, they can't use ships for the Persian Gulf anymore because the Iranians won't allow it. So instead of bringing goods by ship, they have to send them by plane. So the costs for the U.S. military are enormous. And of course, meanwhile, the rest of the world is the Chinese are building their infrastructure, and the Russians, the pressure on Russia has decreased because the United States is focusing less on Ukraine. So it's fighting in West Asia and in Ukraine, on multiple fronts. The Chinese, meanwhile, are watching and definitely very happy to see the United States decline in its strength. And the world blames the United States and the Israeli regime for this whole catastrophic episode, which no one knows when it's going to end nor how it's going to end. So nothing of. I mean, this has been you've discussed this before, and your audience can describe the situation better than I. They're all politically aware, but every day that goes by, things just get worse for the United States.
Mm.
And by the way, now you have to take Japan into consideration, the bond market, and then Trump, when he came to the Persian Gulf region, he was expecting these countries to. He from the beginning he wants to milk these countries as much as possible, and he wanted these countries to contribute to the AI industry in the United States and send trillions of dollars to the United States. Well, not only are these countries not making any money to send to the United States, the Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, but also because of the situation, they're going to have to start withdrawing money from the United States. They're going to have to start selling bonds, and there are indications that they are already doing this. And these are societies that are, they consume a lot, more than any other country. I mean, more than any other Asian country or African or American or European country. They consume a lot, and so the expenses, the amount of money that they'll need to withdraw is going to be huge. And the longer this situation continues, the more difficult it is going to be. Some of them have more, but some of them don't have all that much. The Saudis are not as wealthy as many people think. They've wasted a lot of money in the genocidal war against Yemen. They wasted a lot of money on those mega projects, the line and all these other foolish endeavors. And of course, all of these countries have royal families that take their billions upon billions of dollars. So this is not good for the United States.
Yet we still have this narrative, Professor Marandi. I'll just pull up Christian Zionist fanatic and U.S. envoy to Israel, Mike Huckabee. I feel like this narrative is coming up more and more now that Iran is very, very weak, but, and then there's always a but now. Here is what he said to Fox News today.
The Iranian regime is weaker than it has been in 47 years. The infliction of harm to them and of pain to them is not something that is imagined. Their ability to produce a nuclear weapon has been greatly set back, but their missile capacity, unfortunately, has grown. And in 1 year, they went from being able to deliver a ballistic missile from 2,000 kilometers to over 4,100 kilometers. That puts their capacity to touch any city in most of Europe: London, Paris, Berlin, Rome. All of those cities are now in the just sights of Iran.
So Iran is in a worse position than in the last 47 years, yet it has very, very powerful missiles. And you have now this is the latest report from Washington Post, that the Pentagon is pressing defense firms to build weapons faster as the Iran war of aggression depletes stocks, saying, and this is from Deputy Defense Secretary Steve Feinberg, telling weapons manufacturers that waiting years for the buildup of munitions and the completion of munitions production is just not going to cut it. So, Professor Marandi, what do you make of these contradictions?
Well, he is genocidal, and he is the person who said that if the Israeli regime takes all of the region, that's fine. In other words, if the Israeli regime takes Jordan and parts of Egypt and Syria and Lebanon and parts of Saudi Arabia and parts of Iraq and parts of Turkey and creates the Greater Israel, that's fine. And of course, the methods would be the same as we see in Gaza, the methods used, and the United States would be fully supportive. So, we're dealing with, real evil, when it comes to the elites in Washington. But, we've been hearing this, that Iran is on the verge of collapse. It's weak. And at the same time, we also hear that Iran is becoming more dangerous. And which is, how can it be both at the same time? If Iran is falling apart, then how can it become more dangerous to the rest of the world? But this is something that we've been hearing for decades. And that Iran is weak, it's collapsing, it's imploding, it's unpopular, the people hate it, and then it's a growing threat, and it's dangerous to the entire world. How can it be both at the same time? But this is the narrative that we've been hearing so often, and good. I wrote. I remember when I critiqued some of these memoirs, these fake memoirs on Iran that were written, and I wrote a couple of articles that were published. I addressed these issues, and again, in that book, Going to Tehran, which I advise reviewers to purchase and to read, it goes into detail about many of these myths about Iran. So this is nothing new, what he says. This is something that has been, especially on mainstream media, this has been said since I was a teenager.